I'm the director of the Immigrants. I'd like to welcome all of you. It looks like we have just enough seats. We were worried about running out of room, but we're glad everyone is seated. So thank you for coming tonight to this conference on the rescue of Jews in France and its empire during World War II. Before turning over to Professor Robert Paxton, who will make some opening remarks and then introduce Pierre Sauvage, I just wanted to briefly thank a few people. I want to start by thanking the two people who are responsible for this conference happening. The first is Professor Robert Paxton. We could not have done this conference without him. He's been our senior academic advisor and has been exceedingly generous, not only with his expertise and his ideas, but just as importantly with his time and his consideration, and he's always worked with us with his characteristic grace, and so we're very, very thankful for all of the people. From what I can tell, even though Professor Paxton is in theory retired, he works much harder than many people. We're still working full time, and he works very, very hard and puts in a lot of time helping other scholars who are doing their own research, who are doing conferences, exhibits, films, and he's tremendously generous, and we all owe him a debt of gratitude. The other person who made this conference possible is Harriet Jackson. And in fact, the seed for this conference was planted before I even came to Columbia, when I first heard from her the improbable story of the Rabbi Zalman Schneerson, a Hasidic rabbi of Russian origins who moved to France in the 1930s, and who not only survived throughout the war, never disguised. He's always dressed as a Hasidic rabbi with hat and full beard and long black coat. And not only did he survive, but he managed to bring relief to thousands of fellow Jews and to save dozens of children by hiding them and later by smuggling them even across the border to Switzerland. And Harriet has really been we'll hear more about his story tomorrow, but she's been really at the heart of this conference from the beginning to the end, so I'd really like to thank her for that. We're also very grateful to our conference sponsors, to the Maurice I. Parisier Foundation and its president, Janine Parisier-Clotaire, who's here, who's also a member of our advisory board, and who was very helpful as well in providing input into the conference planning. We'd like to thank the Florence Gould Foundation, the Executive Vice President for Arts and Sciences at Columbia, Mrs. Henri Bélis, and Air France KLM. And I'd like to thank all the members of our advisory board and our foundation, individual and corporate sponsors, without whom none of these activities at the Maison Française would be possible. Finally, our thanks go to all the conference speakers. Thank you for being here, and to the staff of the Maison Française, and to all of you for coming. I should note that there is one change in tomorrow's agenda. Pierre Sauvage, unfortunately, had to stay in Paris because of very serious medical problems in his close family, and so he regrets very much, and we regret very much, that he won't be here to chair the first session tomorrow, or to provide concluding remarks. I'm going to just briefly introduce Professor Paxton, who will then introduce Pierre Sauvage after his opening remarks. Professor Paxton needs no introduction, especially not to all of you here, and he's asked me to be brief, so I will be brief. He is Mellon Professor Emeritus of Social Science at Columbia University. In his histories of Vichy France and Vichy France and the Jews, of course, fundamentally alters historians' understanding of the nature of the Vichy regime and of its anti-Jewish policies. He's also a specialist of fascism and the author of The Anatomy of Fascism and French Peasant Fascism, among other books. And his work has had a wide impact beyond historical circles as well. He was, among other things, called as an expert witness in the trials of WWII and Maurice Papon, and more recently, in 2009, was a guest curator of a brilliant exhibit at the New York Public Library called Between Collaboration and Resistance, French Literary Life Under the Nazi Occupation, that received something like 100,000 visitors. It was a wonderful exhibit. He's lost track, I think, at this point, of the number of filmmakers who have interviewed him for films ranging from films on Marshal Pétain, one on the Atlantic Wall, which we will be showing here in a couple of weeks, and tonight's film of which you'll be seeing excerpts on Varian Fry. So it's a great honor and personal pleasure to welcome Robert Paxton to make opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Annie. For what you said, there's one glaring omission, however, but you couldn't say that the person who really organized the thing is Annie Pierce, the person who really organized it. And indeed many other activities, and this is making a brilliant success out of her work at Marseille. And I'm here to start things, to sort of open up the subject and not to go on for terribly long, because that's what we're going to do tomorrow. A subject, the rescue of Jews in France and the French Empire. And I feel very diffident about standing up before you people and talking about this, because I learned about this subject from books, and many of you learned about it from life. And I feel a little diffident. But nevertheless, this is my assignment, to give some background. And the background we need to sort of place in perspective the issue of the rescue of Jews during the German occupation of France. France, from 1940 to 1944, was a very special case. Everywhere in Europe, everywhere where the German army conquered territory, Jews were in mortal danger. And France was a special case in many ways. First of all, France had the largest Jewish population in Western Europe. It's about 350,000. We don't know exactly how many, because the French have never wanted to include religion or ethnicity in their public documents, identity documents. But we do know that an enormous number of refugees arrived in France in the 1930s. In fact, the French received more Jewish immigrants proportionally than the United States. Of course, that's not saying everything, because the United States notoriously received as few Jewish immigrants as possible during that period. But by 1939, foreigners, refugees in particular, formed about 7% of the French population. And the presence of these strangers exacerbated three deep-seated French anxieties. One was joblessness. The idea was that the immigrants were taking jobs from French people. The second was a sense of cultural dilution, that France was losing its identity in this welter of people with strange accents and different religions. And the third anxiety was that France was going to be dragged into war, because many people thought that France should make war on Hitler, perhaps even a preemptive war. And the rumor went around that the Jewish immigrants were pushing this campaign and were dragging France reluctantly into war. And those three anxieties festered during the 1930s. After the First World War and its moment of national union, anti-Semitism had receded. There isn't a great deal of visible anti-Semitism in the 1920s. It was a low point in the ups and downs of French anti-Semitism. In the 1930s, on the contrary, there was a resurgence of open expressions of anti-Semitism. And all sorts of very respectable writers, people like Jean Giraudoux, for example. This could go on and on. People who were accepted as not extreme in any way, shape, or form, expressed the view that so many immigrants and so many foreigners and so many refugees were a danger to French identity and to French security. And all of these objections and fears came to focus around the Popular Front government of 1936. Léon Blum, France's first socialist and first Jewish prime minister, who was considered by certain number of French people as embodying the threat that unbridled immigration posed. And so there was a powerful backlash, and when defeat came in 1940, this backlash was supercharged into a sense of betrayal and a search for a scapegoat. The scapegoat was Léon Blum, the Popular Front, and the Jews. The second way that France was unique in German-occupied Europe was the only conquered country that was given an armistice. And this was Hitler's idea. It wasn't something that Marshal Pétain extracted from an unwilling Hitler. It was Hitler's idea, and Hitler's idea was that he wanted to, first of all, avoid having the French government go abroad. We know very well what he was thinking. He explained it all to Mussolini. They met in Munich on the 18th of June, 1940. Mussolini, who had just declared war 11 days before and had managed to conquer much territory, but nevertheless wanted to annex Nice, Corsica, Tunisia, and also Hitler said, no, wait a minute, not so fast. If we do that, the French government will go abroad, and that'll give us no end of trouble. And furthermore, if we give the French an armistice, it will be cheap to run the place. The French will run it for us. It was a clever calculation. Hitler wasn't mad, at least not in 1940. He was capable of quite intelligent judgment. And so here was this second originality of the French situation. There was a quasi-independent French government located in Vichy, which had a certain amount of leeway and which could do its own thing. And Hitler wasn't terribly interested in what they were going to do. And so Vichy chose to carry out its own national revolution to replace the despised Third Republic with something that Pétain and French conservatives and indeed a large swath of the French population thought would be more appropriate to the French role in the world and French traditions, something with more muscle, something with firmer values. And within this national revolution was, of course, a project to diminish the role of the Jews. Now, this project of remaking France while half the country was occupied has been described as rebuilding the house while it's still on fire. And it was, in many ways, a mad plan because all you had to do was wait till the end of the war and make whatever changes you want. And you wouldn't be charged with making changes in the presence of a foreign occupying power. But they made that choice. So overwhelming was the desire to get rid of the Third Republic, considered to be responsible for the decline of France, and replacing it with something stronger, more unified, more homogeneous, new authoritarian state. So the part of this program, part of this project, the New France, that concerns us, of course, is a policy of discrimination against the Jews. Now, pretty much everyone accepts nowadays that this was not something that Hitler forced them to do. But that point bears further comment. I think it's not fully understood, but because the German wish in the summer of 1940 was in fact quite the opposite. German policy, of course, evolved, and in the summer of 1940, German policy concerning Jews was to expel the Jewish population from Germany. They were looking for places to send the Jews in Germany, and as of the summer and fall of 1940, the place they wanted to send them, one of the places they wanted to send them was France. What a wonderful idea. All this land, newly conquered France. And so the very week when Marshal Pétain met Hitler and shook his hand in the railway car at Montoire-sur-Lignon on the 22nd of October, the very same day, the Gauleiters of the Rhineland loaded 6,504 Jews on short notice into railroad trains and sent them into France. And there was a great outcry from the Vichy regime. They managed indeed to put an end to that policy, but the 6,000 German Jews were put into camps in the south, and we will hear again more about them in a couple of minutes. And so, what Hitler wanted, Hitler didn't want to make, wouldn't want France to become a Nazi country. Nazism was too good for the French, he thought. And he wanted to have a France that would receive a part of the Jewish population of Germany. So not only do we say that Hitler didn't force the Vichy government to adopt a policy of discriminating against Jews, it was actually contrary to German policy at the moment. So we have here two anti-Jewish projects. We have the French project, which was not exterminationist, though there are certain expressions of opinion in France at this point by some of the more extreme anti-Semites that would point in that direction. But for the moment, it's a program of discrimination, of exclusion from the economy, from the civil service, from positions in intellectual life. And the ultimate hope is emigration. She had too many mouths to feed. They wanted these people to go home somewhere else, and this will come up in some of the papers, at least one of the papers tomorrow. They were looking for places to send French Jews. They were also looking for places to send the refugees from the Spanish Civil War. There were hundreds of thousands of Spanish, and they were trying to get the Mexicans to take those, which is an incident that's very little known. So the Vichy idea was the hope that these people would leave and would go somewhere else. German policy was evolving. At this point, it's expulsion. In 1942, late 41, early 42, it switches to extermination. And when it does, the mechanisms that the Vichy government had set up to diminish the role of Jews in France turn out to be extremely useful for this other project, which was not the French project, but was very useful to it. So there's this interlocking of the two projects that's going on. And the point of this, of course, is to say, in discussing rescue, that Jews in France needed to be rescued simultaneously from French agencies and from Nazi agencies. Now, I'm not going to try to develop a whole set of arguments about rescue. That's to be developed tomorrow. But right away, a couple of major questions come forward. Who were the rescuers, and did they make a difference? These are going to be developed at more length tomorrow, but let me make just a couple of comments. Who were the rescuers? Reading about them, I'm impressed by their extraordinary variety. They come from every class, from every political point on the political compass, from every profession. It's very difficult to generalize about them in any sort of social or intellectual way. There's no magic key that would make you predict who might not. There were some ardent followers of Marshal Pétain among them. You're going to hear tomorrow about the Bishop of Nice, Paul Raymond, who has his tree in the Garden of the Just. He adored Marshal Pétain, but he was a man of humanitarian instincts, and he covered the work of his associates who hid Jewish children in and around Nice. Now, the Just, we know a lot about the Just. There's a dictionary of the Just, a dictionnaire de Juste de France, with something over 2,000 names. I think there are actually 3,000 some French Just now. The number keeps growing, and this is a gross underestimation, because many people modestly have declined to let their candidates go forward. There are some other cases where the person saved was 3 or 4 years old and really doesn't remember anyone's name. There are cases where people who were responsible for saving lives never actually appeared. They made false identity cards and whatnot. So this is a serious underestimation. I don't know what the factor multiplication factor would be, but it might be 2 or 3. And so we wanted in this conference to extend our consideration beyond the familiar territory of the just among the nations recognized at Yad Vashem. We wanted to go beyond to look at Jewish rescuers. I was quite surprised to learn that they are not included at Yad Vashem. There are other ways in which they're memorialized, of course. And, who is recognized as among the just? It has a history, has a politics, and that's going to be one of our subjects as well. We will hold subject session to that. We also wanted to extend our look beyond metropolitan France. This matter is very often, almost always considered in terms of metropolitan France. We wanted to include the empire. And including the empire underlines the French role in this. There were no German troops in the empire except briefly in Tunisia between November 1942 and May 1943. It was by and large outside German control, and so we have to, if we can and should, talk about rescue in the French Empire. This is strictly rescue from Vichy agencies. The Vichy program was applied vigorously in North Africa, in some ways even more vigorously. There was school segregation, for example, in some ways going beyond what was done in the metropole. And so there was rescue work to be done in the empire, and we're devoting a session to that. Eric Jennings' session, and what Rob Satloff has to tell us about some Tunisians. When the Germans were present in Tunisia, deportation became a danger, and there were acts of rescue by some of the Tunisian neighbors, the Arab neighbors of the Jews in question. And that's subject is going to come up tomorrow as well. Now, the other question is, what difference did they make? Obviously, they made an enormous difference. The moral difference is incalculable. The practical difference was very considerable. And yet, extraordinary claims have been made. President Jacques Chirac has said that if 3/4 of the French Jews survived, it was because the good French citizens saved them. And that's not false, but it's surely an overstatement, because there are a number of factors at work here that account for the fact that 3/4 of the Jews living in France survived, and it's very difficult to pick it apart and decide what factors apply. There's geography; there were places to hide. There's the lack of zeal of the administration, which was very important. There were some police who didn't really do what they were told to do. There was sympathy of parts of the population. The greatest variable, of course, of all was Nazi investment of energy, where the Nazis chose to put the weight of their force. Then things happened. In Hungary, for example, in the early summer of 1944, where the Hungarian government had refused to deport any Jews, and suddenly 400,000 people were deported in a couple of months. When the Germans move in and apply their full force. And they didn't have to apply all that force in France because they had the Vichy machinery to work for them, but that's clearly the major variable. And the Italian zone, Italians have been protecting Jews in their occupation zone. When they leave in September 43, the Germans rush in, and at that point, an enormous number of people are taken. And it's the rescuers are overwhelmed, and so it's a very bad moment. Exaggerated claims have been made about these numbers. Only 1/4 taken. Some defenders of Vichy have said we must have been doing something right. And desperate to counter this argument, I came up with the thought that there are more Indians now than there were when the Pilgrims arrived, and that must show that we really treated them nice. I've been trying that in France. It simply shows the inanity of trying to make a global argument on the macro level, drawing conclusions from very large general figures. The interesting work is being done at the micro level. Sarah Gansberger has passed on some very interesting articles to me. It was in the city of Lens in the Pas-de-Calais, where there were 9 991 Jews, and researchers have followed every single case, and each case is irreducibly different. But in Holland, for example, people are comparing individual cities because survival rates were very different from one city to another. Had to do with the attitude of the police, had to do with the presence or absence of German forces, and to some degree, rescuers. It all has to be put into a larger equation, and the rescuers didn't act alone. But, of course, morally speaking, and indeed practically speaking, the rescuers were enormously important. The novelist Serge Dubrovsky, who teaches at NYU, or did teach at NYU, summed it all up brilliantly. I heard him one night, and he said that the people who were taken, the Jews who were taken from France, were taken because of some action of the Vichy government, and those who were not taken because of actions of individual French citizens. And that's probably a little bit too neat, but there was something like that in every case of survival, even if it were only the grace of silence. Someone didn't comment on the arrival of some strange children of a neighboring farmer. So here are a number of things that will be dealt with tomorrow, and I simply wanted to get us started. I want now to pass on to the important business of the evening, which is to see some films, some film images made by Pierre Sauvage. Pierre Sauvage, as you know, is a rescued person himself. He came into the world as a rescued person. He was born in Chambon-sur-Lignon, where his parents were refugees, the extraordinary Huguenot village in the WWII department, which served as a place of refuge for a very large number of refugee families and children. And we had the rare privilege of seeing some of the films that Pierre Sauvage has made. Pierre Sauvage became a documentary filmmaker. His most famous film, dated in 1989, is called Weapons of the Spirit, and it's about Chambon-sur-Lignon. It received the DuPont Columbia Award in Broadcast Journalism for a documentary. It's been shown on PBS. It's a marvelous film, and you're going to see, I think, some parts that were not used, some bits that were not used. Plus, I think we're going to start by seeing some of the opening here, which is quite wonderful. The return of Pierre Sauvage to his native village. But he's also been working on a film about Varian Fry, and we're going to see, I believe, some excerpts from this film. Also this year is a film coming out of him called Peter Bergson, America and the Holocaust, and there's some other bits of current work that I think we're going to see. Pierre Sauvage is also an eloquent advocate of the history and the memory of the experience of the refugees in Chambon-sur-Lignon. In the larger context of the history of the Holocaust, he founded and runs the Chambon Foundation, which works at explaining this history to young people and to the public at large. So I will turn the business over to him, and I think we're going to start.
Start with the opening clip.
Yeah, we're going to start with the opening clips, and then Pierre Sauvage will take it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I know that some of you know the film from which that clip was taken, but I hope you didn't mind being reminded of that particular episode of rescue in Vichy, France, which helps to set the scene, after all, to recall what was possible. It certainly provides a sense of where I'm coming from, literally and in other ways. Mon point de départ. Thank you, Bob. It's quite an honor merely to be following you, let alone to hear those kind words. And I want to thank you, Shani Pierre, Harry Jackson, for inviting me to participate in this conference. A few words of introduction, if I may, before we proceed with what will be a bit of a potpourri, appropriate for Maison Française, potpourri of a presentation in the French culinary sense that I have thrown together a bunch of ingredients, hopefully in a way that works. Like most of you, no doubt, I'm fascinated by history. Although, unlike the impressive group of historians gathered at this conference today and tomorrow, and other historians that I see in the audience, I draw on images and sounds and oral testimony in my own attempts to deal with that time period, the Nazi era that won't let go of me and won't let go of many of you. I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling a bit self-conscious at sometimes that I spend so much time looking back. And that feeling is exacerbated when contemporary events, game-changing contemporary events, pile up, as they have recently, when so much is happening today that cries out for further thought and understanding. Moreover, I remain convinced that most people still have a hard time letting in some of the most challenging facts about the Holocaust and the Nazi era in general, including that distinction between expulsion and murder, which most Americans, I fear, most people don't really understand. As one who is dealing now mainly with the American reaction to that crisis, both in the documentary, which you'll see some clips later, and in another documentary called Not Idly By, Peter Brook's An American Holocaust, I'm acutely aware of just how difficult it is merely to get some basic facts out when those facts are experienced as deeply troubling and confusing. And thus, I hope you will forgive me, but I cannot resist sharing with this particular audience the feeling that I had this past week, that we who deal with the Holocaust may have actually been getting through over the years in some important ways highly relevant to us today. That those among us who have a special interest in rescue during the Holocaust may be getting through too, which makes sense, because rescue is a subject that is always relevant. The Nazis came and went, after all. Rescuers are a permanent feature of the moral landscape. But what I'm getting at now is Libya. On Monday, speaking about his decision to have the US participate alongside France and Britain in airstrikes against the Gaddafi regime, President Obama referred again to his understandable concern that Gaddafi had been about to perpetrate a massacre in the rebel stronghold of Benghazi, and he said, seemingly not reading from the script, "We can't simply stand by with empty words." When President Obama participated in his first Washington Holocaust commemoration as president, he had underscored the importance to us of those who had refused to stand idly by during the Holocaust, specifically and eloquently singling out, I might add, the villagers of the area of the Chambon. Whatever the ultimate outcome of this operation, this Libyan operation, isn't it a little reassuring that a president now realizes, after Roosevelt failed during the Nazi massacre of the Jews of Europe, after Clinton failed in Rwanda, that it would matter if you were remembered as a president who allowed a new massacre to occur on his watch? Is it partly because the work done by historians, maybe also documentary filmmakers to some extent, that presidents, that administrations, that nations will henceforth be judged not solely by what they do, but also by what they fail to do? A quick additional word now, if I may, about historical documentaries, such as what you're going to see. Remarks that are irresistible because of the presence here of so many historians. Quite frankly, you historians don't always take historical documentaries too seriously. Now, before I go on, let me state for the record that some of my best friends are historians. But I know firsthand that even when a documentary is highly relevant and contains much research that was not done elsewhere, it is not always cited as a source in historical works. And rare are the books that include filmographic as well as bibliographic references. Is this because documentaries don't deserve to be cited? because it is too much of a hassle to correctly cite a film? Because there are simply few documentaries worthy of being cited? Or could it be primarily because historians, people of the book after all, have a bias against this other way of telling the stories that we all tell, and that they do not naturally recognize the power and usefulness of the simultaneous use of sound and images? The documentary, by the way, is in some ways the Jew of motion pictures. I am thus especially gratified to have been invited to participate with films in this history conference. But there has also been amazingly little thought given, it seems to me, to the use of documentaries in the classroom, and to the fact that students may tend to think that what is up there on a screen, particularly in the she elitist form of documentary, is automatically true, when it is in fact only at best one particular truth, the filmmaker's truth as he or she sees it. I hope you won't mind, Bob, my evoking the power of an image by mentioning one that involves you and that meant a lot to me. When I had the premiere of Weapons of the Spirit at the Museum of Modern Art in the late 80s, you were kind enough to attend. And I'll never forget that when the lights went on after the movie, and I came up to answer questions, I happened to notice you in the audience, and you did a thumbs up gesture. Forgive me, but that generous and encouraging gesture has lingered with me more than whatever words might have been exchanged later. Indeed, I now remember virtually nothing else about that screening. And this is also the opportunity for me to mention that when I set out to make Weapons of the Spirit in 1982, Vichy et les Juifs by Michael Maris and Robert Paxton had just come out the previous year in France, prior to the American edition, Vichy, France and the Jews. It was my Bible on the historical context for Le Chambon. And it didn't hurt that the book, as we didn't mention, was dedicated to the French men and women who assisted persecuted Jews during the Nazi occupation of France, and rescuers were not then the popular subject they have become. Lastly and briefly, I must also mention how exciting it is for me to speak and show footage here at Columbia. I grew up on the Upper West Side. I'm touched that 3 of my oldest friends are here this evening. With one of them as teenagers, we used to sneak into classes taught here by Dr. Gita May. And if I remember correctly, she never asked what we were doing here or kicked us out. My son, filmmaker David Sauvage, is a graduate of Columbia College. He is also here today with his mom and my wife, Barbara Rubin, who has, in effect, it must be said, executive produced anything of value that I have turned out. Well, in the case of our kids, David and Rebecca, doing the actual heavy lifting. I'm also happy to acknowledge the presence here of one of the more illustrious members of my family, my cousin Samuel Pizarre, survivor of the death camps, and long, among many, many other things, the chairman of Yad Vashem France. I'd like to mention also, because you just saw this clip from Weapons of the Spirit, that there are at least 4 people here who were in Le Chambon during the war. Rudy Appel, Michel Cohen, Max and Hannah Liebman. On to the audiovisuals at last. I begin with some footage that is both very old and brand new, and that I'm showing here for the very first time. When I was making Weapons of the Spirit, I conducted a number of interviews that for various reasons didn't make it into the film. Some were directly connected to Le Chambon and eventually find their way onto a bonus DVD. But there were 3 interviews I did merely in the hope of better understanding what a righteous Christian of the Holocaust might be. I cannot tell you how foreign the very concept of a righteous Christian was to me when I made that film. I come from a very strongly anti-religious background, which clings to me to this day. And as I was assembling 3 righteous Christians for this event, I realized what a large debt I owed to Madeleine Barot, André Dumas, and Jean-Marie Soutou. I had forgotten that while I ultimately didn't use their testimony in the film, having decided to limit myself for the most part to people most directly connected to the story. The testimony by these three people had seeped into and shaped my understanding of the people of Le Chambon. I hope you find this testimony of interest. Please remember that everything tonight is billed as works in progress and that a lot of important technical improvements on sound and picture are only done at the very end of the process. So you'll have to bear with the limitations of what you will be seeing and the occasional glitches that are bound to crop up. Three righteous Christians, trois justes de France. Brief set of clips, and right after that, testimony about the German officer who was responsible for the area of Le Chambon during most of the occupation. But it's not subtitled. The evening is running long. But you promise you'll stay for the fry. Yes. I'll lock the doors. I'm really not, well, I handle this clumsily because part of me really thinks I shouldn't.
You show Fry first.
What?
Can you show the Fry first? Show Fry first.
You know what? I will show Fry first.
First, yes. And
if we have time, we will show the Schmelling sequence. There is a big issue. Those of you who are in the field know that there was at one point a lot of controversy around the German officer who was responsible for that area of France. And I do in my film raise the question. I'm convinced I was right to do so. Did he look the other way? And I include some testimony that relates to that and makes another allegation which I don't know quite what to make of. But I want to move on now to Fry, and if you have time, we will go back to that. And I will have more things to say about this Varian Fry footage after you have seen it, but I will only say now that in addition to bearing in mind that, again, that much needed polishing has not yet occurred, please also remember that this will not ultimately be a short, and that while I hope these clips hold together to some extent, there is much crucial material that you will not be seeing today. You know, by the way, it is sometimes said that a documentary is like a jigsaw puzzle, but that isn't the half of it. A documentary is like a jigsaw puzzle in which no piece of the puzzle necessarily belongs next to any other, and in which each piece changes its shape and appearance depending on where you put it. Mm-hmm. So you are only seeing a few of the pieces of this puzzle that will be changing in appearance and form because of the juxtapositions. And now a few pieces from that puzzle that will eventually be the feature and crown that good, Varian Fry in Marseille. I'd like to make a few concluding remarks, and then I'd be really very happy to answer your questions if you have any, or to comment on your brief comments. By the way, that closing quote from Varian Fry was part of a blunt and emotional foreword that Fry had intended for his 1945 memoir of his Marseille experience, Surrender on Demand. But his editor at Random House kept removing some of Fry's most heartfelt attacks on American policies at the time. And those particular words that you just read are in a folder that is here at Columbia, across the alley at Butler Library in Rare Books and Manuscripts, in a folder marked in Fry's handwriting, suppressed material. I'd like to mention before I go on that, of course, there are several people who are willing to help me with this film who are here today. You recognized a few of them. Obviously, you recognize Dr. Paxton. Also, Dr. Henry Feingold is here. And also Dr. Mordechai Paldiel. And others who are not yet in my excerpt, but who will be in the film, are also here, and I'm very pleased. Dr. Blanche Wiesen-Cook and Dr. Donna Ryan, and Michel Cohen. One thing currently missing from the puzzle you have just seen is Varian Fry's testimony about that Marseille experience. His original draft of his book, by the way, which I reconstructed, is much richer than what was published. And there are also extraordinary and plentiful letters. And I'd like to quote a few of those letters before going to you. February 1941, in a letter to his first wife, Eileen. Among the people who come into my office or with whom I am in constant correspondence are not only some of the greatest living authors, painters, sculptors of Europe, but also former cabinet ministers and prime ministers of half a dozen countries. What a strange place Europe is when men like this are reduced to waiting patiently in the anteroom of a young American of no importance whatever. April 1941, in another letter to Eileen. My work reached a crescendo of activity right after I got back from Lisbon, but it has now slackened off a little so that I'm at least able to breathe. I still begin at 8 in the morning and work until 11 at night, sometimes until 1. I still see dozens of people every day, and I've witnessed the displays of every possible quality of character, from heroic to despicable. I still have poor, driven refugees lurking for me in my hotel in the morning when I go out, and in the evening when I come in. I still have from 6 to 12 phone calls an hour and get 25 letters a day. Sometimes the refugees walk right into my bedroom without knocking or announcing themselves. But the pressure is slackening. Not because the situation is improving, but because more and more of our charges are being re-interned. And I am at long last getting an occasional chance to breathe. It is horrible to be glad that anybody has been arrested. But I had reached a point of nervous exhaustion a few weeks ago where I actually was glad to have a few of the most insistent and most pestiferous clients carried shrieking off. If that isn't candor, I don't know what is. Just 2 more quotes. In a letter to Key Fry aide Albert Hirschman a few weeks after Fry returned to America, Fry wrote, "You say you wonder what the predominant constituent of my temper was during those times, whether enthusiasm, hope, resignation, or outright cynicism. There was a fair measure of cynicism in it, certainly. I entirely agree with you that it is necessary to have a sense of irony if one is to handle human miseries professionally. But there was a good deal of idealism, less and less as time went on, a certain amount of naivete, but above all, yes, Mary Jane, above all, a common orneriness, which I inherit from my Scotch ancestors. It was a tough struggle, and it took all my tough Scotch character to stick it out. By the way, I can't resist mentioning that we French have the best, the pithiest, and untranslatable term for this last aspect of Varian Fry. He was an emmerdeur. Somebody who can drive you nuts. Lastly, something Fry wrote in Spain while he was on his way to exile in America. Having just been kicked out of France to his frustration and unhappiness, he was trying to convey to his wife the marriage had essentially disintegrated while he was in France. That he was no longer the same man that he had been when he boarded the Dixie Clipper in New York just a year before. He put it this way: the roots of a plant in a pot too small will eventually burst the pot. Transplant it to a larger pot, and it will soon fill it. But if you transplant it to a pot altogether too large, it will go to root, as gardeners say, and may even die from the shock. I was transplanted 13 months ago to a pot which more than once, on more than one occasion, I had feared that it was too large. But I didn't die. In the end, I think I very nearly filled it. Not entirely, but nearly. At least I didn't die from the shock or the sense of my inadequacy. Varian Fry. I'd be happy to engage in a little bit of dialogue with you.
Yes, Mr. Sauvage, I congratulate you to this great extract, and of course I will